The sound of bells drifts across the valleys of France, their echoes carried by the wind into towns and villages. To most, bells mean celebration. They announce marriages, feasts, the joining of families. But for one young girl in the year 1526, those bells tolled not for joy, but for duty. Her name was Isabella of Portugal. She was 14 years old, and she was about to be wed to Charles, King of Spain, a man nearly twice her age, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and a man who saw in her not a partner, not a bride, but an heir-bearing vessel. This was the world of dynastic politics in the 16th century. Alliances were not secured by treaties alone. They were sealed in flesh and blood, in the bodies of women too young to bear the weight of crowns. Isabella was one of many sacrificed on this altar of ambition. Her story is not one of romance. It is not even one of survival. It is a story of how power consumed innocence, how politics erased individuality, and how the life of a child was surrendered to a kingdom. Before the bargain, before the border, before the wedding night, there was a girl. Isabella was born in Lisbon in 1503, into the royal house of Portugal. Her childhood was one of refinement and privilege, surrounded by tutors, attendants, and the trappings of nobility. She grew up in a court that prized culture, where poetry, philosophy, and the arts were cultivated as much as politics and war. Like many princesses of the time, her education was deliberate. She learned to read and write in multiple languages, to play instruments, to recite prayers, to carry herself with the grace of a queen-in-waiting. But Isabella was still a child. Her days were filled with games in palace courtyards, whispered secrets with her sisters, and the innocent dreams of a girl who could not yet imagine the world that awaited her. Yet for girls like Isabella, childhood was never meant to last. Their lives were mapped out before they could speak. From the moment she was born, her body became a bargaining chip in the political chessboard of Europe. Kings and diplomats looked at her not as a daughter, but as currency, a pawn that could be traded to secure alliances. By the time Isabella was 10, her name was already circulating in the courts of Europe. The Habsburg dynasty, which controlled Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and much of the Holy Roman Empire, was constantly maneuvering for power against France. Both kingdoms sought Portuguese favor, and Isabella was a perfect prize. It was not her beauty, nor her charm, nor even her lineage alone. It was her womb. In a world where dynasties rose and fell by bloodlines, her ability to produce heirs was worth more than gold. And so, while other children played in fields or studied with tutors, Isabella's fate was decided in chambers filled with men who debated her dowry, her political usefulness, and her capacity to anchor peace between rival kingdoms. She was not present in those discussions. She had no voice. Her childhood was already dissolving into the machinery of statecraft. At 14, Isabella should have been on the cusp of youth, a girl beginning to dream of who she might become. Instead, she was told who she would be. The French crown, desperate to secure peace with Spain, agreed to send her across the Pyrenees to marry King Charles. It was a decision made not for her happiness, but for the shifting sands of diplomacy. The moment the decision was sealed, Isabella's fate was no longer her own. The bells tolled, but not for her joy. They tolled for a contract, a bargain struck between nations. Imagine her at that moment, a girl of 14, staring out of palace windows, perhaps clinging to her mother's embrace, trying to make sense of words like treaty, alliance, and dynasty, words that would shape the rest of her life. There was no romance. There was no choice. There was only duty. Marriage in the 16th century was rarely about love, especially among royals. It was about power, about land, about alliances that could tip the balance of Europe's endless rivalries. For King Charles of Spain, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, marriage was a weapon as powerful as any army. His vast empire stretched across Europe and the New World. But empires are fragile, and Charles needed security. He needed heirs. The French and Spanish crowns have been locked in near-constant conflict for dominance in Italy and beyond. Wars drained treasuries, bled armies, and left commoners weary. Treaties could pause the fighting, but only marriages could promise lasting peace. At least that was a hope. And so, when the time came to negotiate yet another fragile peace, Isabella of Portugal became the bargaining chip. The French crown agreed to hand her over, a gesture meant to prove good faith, to show submission, to bind the two powers by blood. But beneath the polite language of diplomacy, the reality was far colder. Isabella was property. She was not consulted. No one asked her if she wished to marry Charles. No one asked if she dreamed of a different life. The decision was handed down to her like a sentence. She was told she would go to Spain. She would be queen. She would be wife. She would be mother. That was her destiny. But before even the marriage could take place, Isabella endured a ritual so cruel, so invasive, it stripped away the last fragments of her childhood innocence. In a cold chamber, surrounded not by family but by officials, her body was inspected, stripped of dignity. She was examined for purity, proof that she was untouched, that her womb was fit to bear heirs. Imagine the terror of a 14-year-old girl, forced to stand before strangers as they judge her body. This was not medicine. It was humiliation, cloaked in tradition, a ritual designed not to protect her, but to assure Charles that the political investment was sound. Her worth was not measured in her laughter, her intelligence, or her kindness. It was measured in her biology. Could she give him sons? Could she anchor a dynasty? That was all that mattered. For Isabella, the inspection was more than an ordeal. It was a brutal initiation into the life that awaited her, a life where her body was no longer her own, but the property of crown and court. The cruelty did not end with the inspection. The journey to Spain introduced Isabella to one of the most symbolic and devastating traditions of royal marriage, the bride exchange. According to custom, when a princess crossed into the land of her husband, she had to abandon everything from her homeland: clothes, jewelry, attendants, even personal belongings. All were stripped away at the border. She could not carry with her any reminder of France. It was a symbolic rebirth, meant to show loyalty to her new nation. But for Isabella, it was a theft of identity. At the border between France and Spain, she was led into a pavilion erected for the ritual. There, attendants removed her French gowns, unfastened her jewelry, and even dismissed the servants who had cared for her since childhood. Piece by piece, her past was taken from her. What remained was a frightened girl, naked not only of her garments but of her world. In their place, Spanish garments were draped upon her shoulders. The fabrics were rich, the jewels dazzling, the colors bold, but they were not hers. They were costumes of a role she was forced to play. Her language, too, began to dissolve. French was no longer her tongue. She was expected to speak Spanish, to think Spanish, to live Spanish. Even her name was reshaped, bent to Spanish pronunciation, as if to erase the child who once laughed in Lisbon and Paris. The border ritual was meant to impress upon her, and upon all watching, that she belonged fully to Spain now. But beneath the silk and ceremony, it was an act of violence, a severing of roots. Isabella stepped across that border not as a girl, but as an offering. Her life in France was gone, reduced to memories she could never again speak of freely. Her family became distant shadows, her childhood a closed book, and waiting on the other side was Charles, a king twice her age, a man who had not seen her as a daughter or a sister or even a bride. He saw her as an asset, a vessel, a means to an end. For Isabella, crossing that border was not the beginning of a new life. It was the burial of the old one. The marriage ceremony was grand. Priests intoned blessings. Nobles gathered in glittering halls, and the union of France and Spain was celebrated with feasts and music. On the surface, it looked like a triumph of diplomacy. A new queen, a new alliance, a new future. But beneath the surface, the true purpose of the marriage awaited. For in the royal courts of Europe, a wedding was never considered valid until it was consummated. Love had nothing to do with it. What mattered was proof. On the night of her wedding, Isabella was led into the marriage chamber. She was only 14, her body barely matured. Charles was 32, a man seasoned in power and expectation. The court watched, not literally in the room, but through tradition. Servants and attendants lingered outside. Sheets would later be inspected, evidence demanded. For a princess, there was no privacy, no intimacy. Her body was a stage, and the consummation was a performance. Imagine her terror. A girl alone with a man twice her age, knowing that the whispers of courtiers, the legitimacy of treaties, even the stability of kingdoms depended on what happened behind closed doors. For Charles, it was duty. For Isabella, it was violation. When the act was done, the court rejoiced. The alliance was sealed. Treaties had flesh upon them. But for Isabella, something far more fragile had been broken. Her sense of self, her innocence, the last remnants of her childhood. This was no marriage. This was conquest. The Spanish court was magnificent, but it was also suffocating. For Isabella, stepping into it was like stepping into a gilded cage. The halls were vast, decorated with tapestries and gold, but they were cold. The courtiers were polite, but they whispered. She was a foreigner, a girl too young to command respect. Her role was clear. She was there to bear heirs. Loneliness became her constant companion. She had left behind her family, her friends, her homeland. The language around her was unfamiliar, the customs strange, the expectations heavy. Even when surrounded by attendants, she was isolated. And soon, the true weight of her marriage bore down on her. Pregnancy. At 15, she conceived her first child. The court was filled with anticipation, the air thick with the hope of a male heir. But the pregnancy ended in heartbreak, a miscarriage. Whispers began. Was she too young? Was she cursed? Was she unfit to be queen? None dared speak openly, but in corners and corridors, doubt spread. Yet Isabella had no reprieve. Barely had she recovered before she was pregnant again. Another fragile life stirred within her. Another hope for the dynasty. But again, fate was cruel. Another loss. Each miscarriage, each stillbirth, was not merely a private grief. It was a public failure. In the eyes of the court, in the eyes of Charles, Isabella's worth was measured in children, and each empty cradle diminished her value. Still, she endured. Pregnancy after pregnancy. Fragile infants, stillborn children, losses that would break even the strongest of women. And she endured them as a child herself. At 16, she had lived through more grief than most do in a lifetime. The pressure was relentless. Charles was often absent, consumed by wars, politics, and empire. When he was present, he offered little comfort. To him, Isabella was necessary, but not beloved. Their conversations were brief, their intimacy mechanical, their connection hollow. At court, she was watched constantly. Her meals, her movements, even her rests were scrutinized. Was she eating enough? Was she healthy enough? Was she showing signs of pregnancy? Her body was never her own. It belonged to the dynasty. And so Isabella, barely out of childhood, lived in a world of marble and gold, yet felt nothing but emptiness. Her letters, where fragments survive, speak of longing for family, for home, for kindness. But kindness was rare in a world built on ambition. Her eyes grew weary. Her spirit dimmed. Each loss carved deeper into her heart. The girl who once played in courtyards in Lisbon was gone. In her place stood a queen, draped in jewels, wrapped in silks, but hollowed by grief. By 17, Isabella's body bore scars that no one could see. Scars from pregnancies that never reached term. Scars from nights of grief. Scars from being treated as a vessel rather than a human being. Yet the pressure never relented. The court whispered with every passing month. Charles grew colder with every failure. And Isabella herself clung to hope, not for love, perhaps not even for joy, but for survival. A son could mean security. A son could silence the whispers. A son could finally justify her existence in a world that valued her only for her womb. And so when she became pregnant again, the palace was alive with expectation. The queen was watched more closely than ever. Every sign, every symptom was scrutinized. Servant hovered. Physicians intervened. Courtiers speculated. The fate of 2 kingdoms seemed to rest in her belly. For Isabella, The pressure was unbearable. She prayed. She endured the physical toll. Sickness, exhaustion. The frailty of her youth weighed down by the demands of her body. By now she was 17, still little more than a girl, and yet she carried the weight of empires. The pregnancy advanced. For a time, there was hope. Physicians assured Charles this one might succeed. Courtiers whispered of names, of celebrations, of a new heir who would strengthen Spain's throne and France's alliance. But history is merciless. Complications struck. Whether it was infection, exhaustion, or the sheer toll of so many pregnancies forced upon her so young, Isabella's body could not carry the burden. The final pregnancy ended in heartbreak, like the others. And this time, the court's disappointment was sharper. To lose one child was tragedy. To lose many was weakness. For Isabella, it was devastation. Her health crumbled. Her spirit dimmed. 17 years old, and her life had already been consumed by grief, by politics, by expectations she could never fulfill. She had been given no choice, no freedom, no chance at joy. From the moment the bells tolled at her wedding, she was bound in chains invisible but unbreakable. History rarely records her voice. The chronicles of the time speak more of treaties and kings than the girl who suffered in silence. But in those silences, her story emerges, a story of erasure, of sacrifice, of the human cost behind political triumphs. History remembers kings. It remembers the wars they fought, the treaties they signed, the empires they carved across maps. Charles of Spain is remembered as a ruler, a strategist, a man who held vast power in his hands. But what of Isabella? For centuries, her story has been little more than a footnote, her name mentioned only in passing, her life reduced to statistics of births and deaths. Yet behind those numbers was a girl stripped of her childhood, a girl forced into marriage before she understood what it meant, a girl examined, exchanged, and erased. Her story is not unique. Throughout history, countless young girls were sacrificed to dynasties. They were bartered as pawns, their bodies inspected, their identities erased, their worth measured only in children. Their names are forgotten, their grief unrecorded. But they were there. They endured. And though history did not honor them, their suffering was real. To remember Isabella is to remember them. It is to remember that behind every treaty, every royal wedding, every alliance, there were human lives, lives shaped by coercion, lives burdened with expectations, lives cut short by grief. For Isabella of Portugal, marriage was not a love story. It was a tragedy, a slow erasure of a girl who might have laughed, who might have dreamed, who might have lived a life of her own choosing. And so as we look back, we must ask ourselves, how many voices have been lost to silence? How many stories remain untold because history deemed them unworthy? The chronicles may forget them, but we do not have to.